folks, this is Woody. Welcome back to the shed and the Moss Trooper Minisport. Making friends with the Minisport. The title of this episode came about as a result of some questions that a new Minisport owner asked me. Not wanting to throw himself into the air without having done a bit of homework, he asked me for any advice I might be able to give about flying the aircraft. He's bought a tail dragger version with the SC-33 engine, so our aircraft are practically identical, and he thought I'd have something useful to say. Well, I'm not a test pilot, I'm not an instructor, and I'm probably not more than an average pilot. But I do have about 300 hours in the aircraft, so you'd think I would have something useful to say about flying it, wouldn't you? Well, as I started chatting on the phone, I realised that I really didn't have any firm parameters for takeoff, landing, or anything else come to that. Everything I thought I could say about these was in vague terms. I even had to think about which way the nose went as the tail comes up on takeoff. Basically, I've been flying by rote, using a lot of muscle memory and habit and not really thinking about it too much. So that's the reason for this episode in my Minisport story, and probably should have come about 290 flying hours ago. Everything I'll talk about is my experience and opinion, and all the other Minisport pilots in the world might disagree with some, most or all of it. But I was asked to do it by someone who thinks it would be useful, so if you think it's all complete rubbish, say so and we can all learn. Right then, let's open the hangar doors and start with a few observations about pre-flight inspections and all that. And some of those are driven by my decisions when I completed the kit. My arrangements of the cockpit are unique to me, as is every other SD1, and I must confess to being one of those people who likes lots of toys to play with. On top of that, I did a diploma course in ergonomics many years ago, and having suffered in various aeroplanes from designers with no concept of how humans interact with machines, I spent a lot of time designing my cockpit to suit my preferences, rather than what Igor might have had in mind. Basics here, really. The throttle friction arrangement as designed doesn't work and requires constant tightening, so I replaced it with a locking tooth collar. It still isn't perfect, but better. After experiments with trimming for best glide after an engine failure, I added a further notch of back trim which is easier to find in a hurry. I did my own carburetor heating system, and the warning light flashes continually while it's selected. Some people might find this distracting, but it acts as a constant reminder that it's on. This might be important if I have to throw an approach away and need full power. The fuel cock appears to work against logic. It would normally be up for on, but the way I installed the valve made it this way. I considered changing it, but now it's part of, as I said before, muscle memory. If I change it now, I might make a critical error in the future under pressure. So it's labelled, but it's just something to watch, particularly if someone else flies the aeroplane apart from me. The hood lock is simple, but relies on quite small movements of the components to be effective. You can see here the tiny difference between locked and not. When I lock it, I always give the whole thing a good nudge with my elbow to be sure. The design specifies that 2 Allen screws hold the mechanism together, but because there are no nuts holding them in, they can creep. We replace one of them for that reason with a bolt and a nut. I know that there's been at least one incident of the canopy opening in flight. While we're on the subject of canopies, I never have mine open when the engine's running. The hinges are flimsy and wouldn't take much to be damaged. I fitted a carbon monoxide detector that has a very loud alarm. Given that the onset of exhaust gas poisoning is so subtle, the popular stick-on red dot warning tabs are, in my opinion, almost useless and probably downright dangerous as a result of that. I can hear the alarm over the noises at cruise power, and it might just bring me back into a state where I can do something about the problem and not die while I'm asleep. There are 2 stowage pockets for pens, paper, pitot cover and all that. They're made from things made for cars. They cost pennies and work just as well as the others you can find. Very useful to have a place to stow odds and ends that you might need in the air. This is because if you drop anything while flying, it'll stay dropped for the rest of the flight. There's absolutely no wriggle room in this office and no chance of contorting yourself enough to recover a dropped pen. If I know I'm going to need lots of bits and pieces to hand for a long flight, I wear one of these fishing vests. Looks a bit weird, but really useful and means nothing gets forgotten and is easy to find in a hurry. And finally, for the pre-flight stuff, some real trivia. No, I'm not a Biggles wannabe. I did once audition for the role of Douglas Bader, but I didn't get it. I don't have the legs for it, apparently. Anyway, so what's with the flying suits, helmet, boots and all that? This is just basic ergonomics again. The boots keep my feet warm. They're an essential stage from my map in the left boot, copies of other info in the right. If you think that's silly, you ain't flown a Minisport out the circuit, or you rely too much on your smartphone. On top of that, every grass airfield I visit has a habit of being wet, and trainers are like blotting paper. I actually like dry, warm feet. Weird, I know, but that's just me. The helmet will help preserve my brains, while I have them, if the world tries to beat its way in, and the goggles mean I don't have to try to wear specs. Their arms are uncomfortable under a well-fitting helmet, and I'm sure one day I'll puncture the gel pads. If I need to read small print on maps, the goggles not only carry a stick-on reading lens, but act as an eye shade and means I don't have to wear sunglasses, which I hate. I'd rather squint, which you might have noticed. The flying overalls let me do a proper pre-flight inspection, crawling underneath in the mud and the grass and the wet, and otherwise doing all those dirty jobs without messing up my chinos. Okay, let's do a walk round. Well, no. That'd be teaching Granny to suck, but there are some things on the Moss Trooper that aren't as drawn by Igor. I changed the cam lock fasteners on the cowling from slot heads to cross heads. To lock these things you have to push and then turn, and with a slot head the blade of the screwdriver was always slipping and gouging the cowling. I made a tool that traps the head of the screw, but even then it meant carrying a slot head driver for the upper cowling and a cross head driver for the lower. This is silly, so I changed them all to crosshead, and the driver now doesn't slip. The worst thing though about these fasteners is that they fall out when the top cowling is removed. If this happens on grass, when you oblige some curious visitor who wants to see the engine, then either spend an hour looking for them by crawling about in the wet grass, see overalls the wearing of, or carry spares. At £5 a pop this gets annoying. I've tried using plastic retainers on the back of the fasteners, but they don't always stay in place, and you only know they've failed after the fastener takes a walk. I carry a sheet of plastic to put under the engine if I ever have to take the cowling off. It acts as a catch net. The fastener for the dipstick cover has a wing nut finisher, which makes it much more likely that I'll trouble to open it if I don't have to go looking for a screwdriver. I don't know how often you might take the lower cowling off to check everything, but probably not before every flight, right? Because of all those screws. Before every 5 flights? Maybe. Anyway, however often you do it, it might be worth checking just here. If you cover your downpipes with insulation like I do, you may not notice that the engine vibration can get bad enough at some RPM settings to rip the flexible pipes apart. If for no other reason, this is a good one to fit a carbon monoxide warning in the cockpit. While we're looking under the engine lid, I guess it's obvious that the dipstick doesn't read correctly if the aircraft is on the ground, so filing in some alternative marks removes any doubt as to the true oil level and the flight attitude. The same goes for fuel levels. I've got a wooden dipstick for ground checks and cockpit labels for in-flight, and they don't read the same. Moving on, the spats are secured by screws, and these have a habit of working their way out. Worth checking before every flight, otherwise the very, very flimsy fairings can vibrate to a point where they break. I've lost 4 screws so far, and now use Loctite instead of the spring washers. The pitot tube's removable, which is a good idea since it's at just the right height for onlookers to collide with it at fly-in static parks and then break it off. The downside is that it's possible to forget to refit it prior to takeoff, which is why it's on my takeoff checklist, of which more later. So, apart from the usual stuff, count the wings, wiggle the bits that should move and shake the bits that shouldn't, we're ready to fly. Starting the engine is straightforward, and the sequence in Igor's notes spells it out. My personal checklist goes like this.
Fuel on, brakes on, throttle closed, switches off, battery on, oil pump on, engine monitor on. "30 seconds to prime, altimeter zeroed." oil pump off, fuel pump on, switch is on, check set, throttle set. Clear prop!
The engine normally fires up immediately, so I push the choke off almost straight away and keep the engine to about 1800 RPM until she's stable, checking the oil pressures up. It'll normally show about 1.5 bar at this stage, perhaps a shade more if it's really cold. All the warning lights should be out. At this stage I can turn off the fuel pump and turn on the rest of the electrical items. On a typical day it'll take about 4 to 5 minutes to get the temperatures up to a point where I can do a power check, minimum 40 degrees C on the oil. The operator's manual states that the max takeoff power is 3100 RPM. This had me foxed for a while, but maybe it's one byproduct of using Google to translate from Czech to English. What Igor means is that the minimum static RPM should be 3100. Perhaps he meant, as he wrote it, that as long as we have 3100 on the brakes, we'll have enough to get airborne. Whatever, because I can't get too much beyond 2950 before the aircraft overcomes the brakes and starts to roll. If you have a helpful ground crew, maybe you could do this on the chocks, but I don't often have that luxury. Now we come to the takeoff. Arguably this is the most exciting part of flying the Minisport, so it should be enjoyed for all the adrenaline it generates. Let's face it, we fly to get a buzz, right? Well, be prepared to get all the fizz you need in about 10 seconds if you get it wrong. Actually, it ain't that difficult as long as you're aware that the aircraft is short on length, which means it's long on wriggly. A small input of steering has a remarkable effect on direction. I liken it to my wife's smart car. It steers like a supermarket trolley because the distance between the back wheels and the movable front ones is about as far as I can reach. Have you ever tried to reverse this really small trailer or had one of those aforesaid trolleys with a dodgy wheel? Remember how it goes all over the place? Well, shake hands with the tail dragger Minisport and hopefully make a friend. Pre-takeoff checks. We all do them, right? In their simplest form, they can be in accordance with Igor's notes: altimeter, trim, controls, canopy, harness and flaps. Personally, and being a creature of habit instilled by the Royal Air Force, I had my own sequence which some might recognise, with a few modifications. Trim, set neutral, throttle friction adjusted, choke off, carb heat tested and off, fuel cock on, pump on, contents checked, flaps as required, pitot tube fitted, covers removed, pressures and temperatures within limits, harness tight and locked, hood closed, locked and elbowed, controls full and free, and the carbon monitor on. 2 T's, 2 C's, 2 F's, 2 P's, 2 H's, 2 C's. Now this is where I learnt something as a result of that telephone conversation. Phil asked me what my takeoff technique was, and I said full power on the brakes until they slip, then stick fully forward to get the tail up, check the nose swing and dip, and wait until she feels light enough to fly, at which time I've probably been catapulted into the air by a bump in the runway, or words to that effect. He'd been advised that he should apply power without brakes, hold the stick back for a bit, and then lift the tail and fly. Now I've never done that, mainly because the runway conditions at Easterton don't make it that easy. There's a bump in the runway that's perfectly placed to catapult the aircraft into the air before full flying speed is reached. If this happens with the tail still down or transitioning, then I'm in the air in an aeroplane that really wants to be on the ground. This is a bad thing. Hence my usual routine of getting it up early. The tail, right? And I've accepted that a lively footwork on the rudder is just a Minisport thing. So following that phone conversation, I've experimented with the stick back until flying speed technique as various airfields with tarmac, long grass and short, level and bumpy surfaces, and I think it's fair to say that although it takes marginally longer to get off to the ground, holding the stick hard back and thus weighting the tail wheel for as long as possible does seem to make the takeoff a little less dramatic. Videos do show a little less rudder input, but I think it's probably no big deal on grass, perhaps a more useful technique on tarmac, particularly with a crosswind as you can see here, when you'll need all the directional help you can get. This brings me to a further point about rudder authority. Obviously we need enough air over it to make it effective, which means enough speed. If the tail's raised too soon, it takes away the effectiveness of the tail wheel steering before the rudder's got enough bite to keep the aircraft straight. If the crosswind's from a left, the torque-induced right swing as the tail comes up is balanced. But if it's from the right, then beware, there might not be enough directional control available. This won't apply to tri-gear aircraft with a steerable front wheel, of course, but I guess you could say that they're missing all the fun anyway with the little wheel at the wrong end of the airplane. This is the situation on the tarmac runway at Longside, and I was glad I'd been given the chance to think about keeping the stick back and the little wheel on the ground a bit longer. Lastly, on the takeoff technique, I've got into the habit of not using flaps, especially if there's any kind of crosswind. One of my earlier videos shows the effect of a loss of flaperon, read aileron, authority when flaps selected. Even a mild crosswind can make holding the interwind wing down a little bit of a challenge, so to add to the difficulties by removing some roll control is something I can live without, thank you. Righto, now that we're airborne, it's time to have more fun. I did some video of sustained turning performance, stalling behaviour and all that, but that's something that will vary between individuals and aircraft, so I haven't included it here in any detail. Enough to say that the airplane will hold a sustained turn rate of about 24 degrees a second at my weight, going slightly faster than that to the right. And it really doesn't stall in the conventional sense. None of that shuddering, violent wing rock, nose slicing, all that. It just goes from a nose-high wings level cruise to a nose-high wings level descent without too much else changing if the trim's fully nose up, which needs to be remembered since that's how it'll be set for final approach, or thereabouts. There's a short sequence here which shows the aircraft basically settling into a stalled descent with no input from me, though I'm guarding the controls quite carefully because I have a good pension and plans for a longer life. There's no overt indicator that the wings are no longer doing their job, which could catch you out. I haven't tried stalling with a lot of rudder input because I don't know what might happen, but if someone has done it, perhaps you'd share your experience. Since I haven't read of any SD1 stall spin accidents, I guess you've got away with it. Now, landing. The cockpit's quite cramped and your body might be a bit stiff, so do some wiggling of the feet, ankles, knees and elbows and get warmed up because you're going to really need them in a minute. Things can get lively. My approach technique, apart from working out where the airfield is, follows a version of the RAF drill, fire rack. Fuel pump on, do I have enough? Instruments, check the engine. Radio, tune the frequency and listen. Plot the other traffic positions and rehearse your joining calls so you don't sound like a complete amateur. A for the altimeter pressure for the field, and C for carb heat. This is where it starts getting interesting, because the SD1 is a very slippery aeroplane. This is a good thing most of the time, but trying to slow down to land can be a real challenge if you don't plan it right. Without labouring the point, you need to plan to slow down a lot earlier than maybe you're used to. And once at circuit speed of about 55 knots, concentrate on keeping everything stable. If you fly a rectangular pattern, then I'd recommend pulling the power back to idle as you turn base and trimming a lot. In fact, trim all there is into the nose-up range or thereabouts. You really want to avoid getting high or fast, since killing excess speed can be a real problem. There's the potential for owning a lot of speed that we'd rather trade but nobody's buying. Since you can't reduce power to arrest any overshoot, since you'll be at idle already, there are two options left. Lower the nose and pick up 10 knots almost straight away and overspeed the flaps, or side slip. Not many people practice that on finals, so maybe you want to get comfortable with the technique at a safe altitude, because you're going to need to do it at some time, and I'll bet on that. The videos show the potential for getting it wrong, what happens if you do, and ways to overcome the problem. I fully accept that some of this might be down to my own ineptitude, but I've tried all kinds of ways to sort it out, and I've come to the conclusion that to fly a standard tight GA circuit in this aircraft is asking for a high fast final approach that isn't going to end well, particularly if you've opted, perhaps because of a crosswind, for a flapless approach. I reverted to what some call the military circuit, where I fly a curving final approach with lots of side slip to kill height without gaining speed. This is great if I'm the only one on the circuit. If there's anyone else and they're flying a normal on finals but barely visible with a threshold type of approach, then I could end up wanting to turn in ahead of them, which I won't do. So I have to go 2 miles further downwind to fit in behind, and so get forced into a slow, flat approach from 10 fields out, which isn't good if the engine quits. Flaps will obviously make it a little easier to cope with all this, and given no crosswind, I use full flap as a speed brake once I'm sure of the making the runway. Here's an approach at inch, which has an electricity wire just short of the threshold, which is about 20 feet off the ground, and it rules out a flat final. I cross the wires at 50 feet and select full flap at that point to bring the touchdown closer, or I'd be landing in the overshoot wheat fields. There's a very pronounced pitch down trim change when flap selected, so if this is done close to the ground, be ready for it. Certainly I've found that selecting full aft trim and carb heat when I'm downwind will give me a fairly stable 55 knot cruise at about 2600 RPM, and I'll select half flap then, towards the end of the downwind leg, but wait until established on finals before taking the last stage if I need to. Even then, the slightest lowering of the nose will generate an acceleration beyond the flap limiting speed of 57, so the last stages of the approach puts me basically blind to the runway, which is why I prefer to side slip and keep those pesky gliders that are cluttering the threshold in sight until the last moment. I don't use full flap unless the strip is very short or I need to kill an overshoot situation. I approach at 50 knots, 55 if there's any crosswind. Just before the flare, I check back to a little more nose up and add a little power, just enough to arrest the sink, and then progressive nose up to land on 3 points. Eagle's advice is to use some throttle to slow down speed. Again, this is Babelfish at its best. He obviously means to reduce the rate of descent. I don't do wheeler landings, or rather, I don't do wheeler landings anymore. The prop is very close to the ground at a level attitude, and the undercarriage has a huge amount of flex in it, which could easily cause you to shorten your propeller by a few centimetres if you hit a bump at the wrong moment. Trust me on this one. Taxiing. Oh, come on, you say. I don't need advice on that, do I? Well, maybe not, but if you've managed to land in an above the limits crosswind and are congratulating yourself on your ace status, be prepared to have to do a 270-degree turn into the wind to backtrack if you haven't thought about it before you turned almost downwind off the runway. And if you're on tarmac, you brave fella, then just switch off, get out and push. Just saying. So that's my take on operating the Minisport as it applies to me and my bumpy grass strip where there's often a crosswind and other traffic which isn't predictable in its behaviour. So far it's worked, but that's not to say that my procedures are the right ones or that I'm not going to change anything if I get convinced otherwise. Certainly my takeoff techniques already changed in some circumstances, so there's always something new to learn. I hope this gives rise to some critical comments so I can learn even more. But bye for now, and Slava Ukraino!